Neoplatonism. The painting is Plotinus in the red toga, behind Zoroaster, holding the starry globe in Raphael's The School of Athens, 1509. I'll give you a second to look at that. Okay. And here we are continuing the Hellenistic age, which is the third part of volume 1 of David Livingstone's Ordo ab CHAO. I'm not sure how much more of this series I'll be reading. It's obviously a very long series. It has 6 volumes, around 20 parts per volume. I'm only finishing up part 3 of volume 1 right now. I'd like to read more of it, but just letting you guys know I'm not going to be able to read, obviously, all of it, or even all of volume 1, within, a short amount of time at least, might go a few months into the future. Who knows? Maybe a few years down the road I'll be reading this stuff. But I would like to get onto some other works soon. But here I'm going to finish up this part, and then we'll see about part 4 of the book of Revelation after that. But right now I just want to wrap this up. So, essentially, the Gnostics combined the terminology of the Neoplatonists and the mythology of the mysteries with Christianity. Neoplatonism and the emergence of the mysteries of Mithras were closely connected to the royal family of Emesa, today Homs in Syria, a dynasty of priest kings who formed a powerful and influential aristocracy. Emesa was renowned for the temple of the sun, known as Elijah Balium, a derivation of Baal. It was adored in the shape of a black stone. Around 64 BC, Pompey the Great had reorganized Syria and the surrounding countries into Roman provinces and had installed client kings who would be allies to Rome. One of these client kings would be Sampsiceramus, the founding member of the priest-king dynasty of Emesa, who lived in the 1st century BC. And here are some coins. The Emesa temple to the sun god El Gabal, with the holy stone on the reverse of this bronze coin by Roman usurper Uranius Antoninus. Okay. The next image is Philo of Alexandria, also called Philo Judaeus, the greatest representative of Hellenistic Judaism. What a picture. The influence of Greek thought in the Hellenistic age derived primarily from a school of philosophy developed at Alexandria and thought to issue from Plato, known as Platonism. It appears that Plato in his later years became increasingly devoted to the teachings of Pythagoras, and that he finally came to view his idea of forms as numbers. Plato arrived at a system of opposed first principles and a triple division of levels of being, which granted a central position to the role of soul, both world soul and the individual soul. And as we know from reading Crowley's Book of Thoth previously, that those principles align with Kabbalah. Developing the doctrine of the Pythagoreans as first principles, Plato established the one and the indefinite dyad. The one, or monad, is an active principle imposing limit on the formlessness of the opposite principle, the dyad. The dyad is a duality, that on which the one acts, but it is also the irrational aspect of the soul and the underlying substance of the universe, the receptacle of the Timaeus. Essentially, as explained Xenocrates, Plato's successors to head of the academy, the monad and the dyad are the philosophical rendering of the pagan trinity. The monad represents the father, while the dyad represents the dual-natured goddess, taken from the ancient trinity. By acting on the dyad, the one generates the form numbers. First, the dyad produces the number 2 by doubling the 1, then produces the other numbers by either adding to 2 and to each successive number the 1 or itself. However, Plato took only those numbers up to 10 as constituting forms. A special importance was placed by Plato, as it was by the Pythagoreans, on the primal numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, the tetractys, and their sum total, 10, or the decad. These 4 also have a geometrical aspect. 1 is the point, 2 the line, 3 the triangle or plane, and 4 the solid, in the shape of a pyramid. And again, Crowley talks about the same stuff. The 4 basic numbers assume their geometric aspect in world soul, from which the 4 dimensions are projected upon matter, through combinations of basic triangles to form the 4 elements. The next phase of Platonism, or Middle Platonism, emerged as the result of a new influence, that of Neo-Pythagoreanism, if in fact the two movements were not the same. A curious series of texts had emerged in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, claiming to be the works of the original Pythagoreans. It was in this period that the myth of Pythagoras as the student of Oriental wisdom took shape, reflecting later in the biographies by Diogenes Laertius, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. However, according to John Dillon, noted scholar of Middle Platonism, only certain works attributed to the original Pythagoreans, namely Philolaus and Archytas, are possibly genuine, though as far as the other works are concerned, much about them remains obscure, and little is known as to who wrote them and why. One of the most important exponents of Middle Platonism was the Greek-speaking Jewish philosopher of the 1st century A.D., Philo of Alexandria, also called Philo-Judaeus, the greatest representative of Hellenistic Judaism. Although a devout Jew, Philo attempted to rationalize Judaism with his version of Platonic philosophy. The Bible, to Philo, was compatible with Platonic philosophy, for according to him, perhaps in reference to the legends reported by Iamblichus or Artapanus, Plato was a follower of Pythagoras, and Pythagoras had been a follower of Moses. In the most important innovation of Middle Platonism, according to John Dillon, was Philo's placing of a transcendent God, equated with the God of the Old Testament, above the monad and the dyad. These notions, though, hold striking similarities with those regarded as the early developments of the Kabbalah, the monad representing the primordial man, the dyad the Shekinah. In fact, Philo praised the Essenes, and in the Contemplative Life, he describes the rites and habits of the Therapeutai, and in support of his ideas, he often used the phrase, "it is said," presumably referring to Jewish traditions. For example, it is said that Moses was enchanted by the music of the spheres when he was receiving the revelation on Mount Sinai. Ultimately, in the opinion of Moshe Idel, a leading modern scholar of the Kabbalah, there seems to be extant evidence for the existence of Hebrew traditions that may mediate between Philo's views or other ancient Jewish traditions parallel to Philo and the emergent Kabbalah. Below the supreme God, the monad becomes the Stoic logos, the active principle of God's creative thought. To Philo, he who drives the chariot of the powers is the logos, and he who is born in the chariot is he who speaks the logos, giving commandment to the driver for the right driving of the universe. The logos is the mediator between God and creation, which at one point he identifies as a second God. The logos is the primordial or archetypal man, the image of God. Therefore, the logos is the macrocosm, a reflection of the earthly man, who is the microcosm. The Logos proceeded from God and Sophia, and is described as the Son of God and Sophia, through whom the universe came into existence. Sophia, or wisdom, is the dyad. Like the Shekinah, she is the female life principle assisting the supreme God in his work of creation and administration, but also somehow fulfilling the role of mother to all creation. Here's an image of Poseidonius. Maybe that's how you say it. The man largely responsible for the development of the Neo-Pythagorean movement and the fusion of Platonism and Stoicism was Poseidonius, a native of Apamea in Syria near Emesa. Little is known of Poseidonius's thought, but some of his teachings have been preserved by his pupil Cicero. Being learned in Magian astrology and demonology, Posidonius was concerned with magic. Cumont, explaining the nature and source of Neo-Pythagoreanism, stated, although by its ideal of religious life it professed to connect itself with the old Pythagorean mysticism, its doctrine owes more to the theories developed by Posidonius, especially in his commentary on the Timaeus, and it borrowed much either through the medium of the great Syrian or even directly from Oriental religions. About the middle of the 1st century AD, a distinct Neo-Pythagorean trend appeared with the mystic Apollonius of Tyana, a Pythagorean philosopher whose miracles in raising the dead and healing the sick have been compared to those of Christ. During his travels, he associated with the Brahmins of India, the Gymnosophists of Egypt, and the Babylonian Magi, who initiated him in the Chaldean mysteries. In Rome, Apollonius was arrested and tried before Emperor Domitian for sorcery, for having predicted a plague at Ephesus. He claimed it was merely his moderate diet that kept his senses clear and enabled him to see the present and the future. Nevertheless, according to his biographer, Apollonius managed to inexplicably vanish from the courtroom. This is Numenius of Apamea. The Neo-Pythagorean philosopher chiefly responsible for the transition of Platonism to a Neoplatonic synthesis of Hellenistic, Persian, and Jewish systems was Numenius of Apamea, who flourished in the late 2nd century AD. Numenius showed extensive knowledge of Judaism and may have been acquainted with Christianity. Numenius intended to seek the origin of Platonic ideas in the teachings of the ancient East, the spirit transmigration of Hinduism, the monotheistic deity and the Trinity in Judaism, and the esoteric dualism of Gnostic and Hermetic cults. To explore the nature of God, Numenius insisted one had to look back beyond the wisdom of Plato, or even Pythagoras, to everything that the Brahmins, the Jews, the Magi, and the Egyptians have established. According to the church father Origen, Numenius offered allegorical interpretations of the writings of Moses and the prophets. He had remarked, "What is Plato but Moses speaking in Attic Greek?" Another important philosopher of Middle Platonism was Plutarch, seen here, of Chaeronea, a priest of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Plutarch's teacher, Ammonius Saccas, who had been in charge of the Platonic Academy at Athens, was an Egyptian and probably responsible for the introduction of the Pythagoreanizing and astrological Alexandrian influences to the Academy. In his essay on the at Delphi, Plutarch explained that, according to Ammonius, the sublunary realm was ruled over by a god, or rather daemon, whose office is concerned with nature in dissolution and generation, who is known as Hades or Pluto, in contrast to the god who rules over the heavenly realm, who is Apollo. According to Plutarch, the supreme god responsible for creating the world, and commonly worshipped by the ignorant masses, is actually the evil god, while the true god is that one mistakenly accused of evil. This god or demon should be called Hades or Pluto, god of the underworld, or the sublunary realm. As mediator, the Logos is the messenger of the gods, which Plutarch equated with Mithras, the mediator god of the Zoroastrians. Plutarch talked of the one and the dyad, without the idea of the supreme principle above them. However, he maintained God must relate to the world through intermediaries, first of which is the Logos. For Plutarch, the Logos is the equivalent of the sun god of ancient paganism. Ruins of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where Plutarch of Chaeronea served as one of the priests responsible for interpreting the predictions of the Pythia. Numenius's thought is alleged to have influenced the first Neoplatonist Plotinus. Born in Egypt, Plotinus, like Plutarch, had also been the pupil at Alexandria of Ammonius Saccas, who may have been the intermediary for Numenius's ideas. Moshe Idel, a leading scholar of the Jewish Kabbalah, has indicated that the quest for mystical union in the thought of Plotinus may have been derived from Jewish sources, possibly from Philo of Alexandria and Rabbi Akiva. Supposedly, Ammonius had been brought up as a Christian but abandoned his religion for the study of Plato, developing his own variation of Platonic philosophy. In The Life of Plotinus, Periphery reported that through Ammonius, Plotinus became eager to investigate the Persian methods and the system adopted among the Indians. Plotinus was the teacher of Porphyry, who was born in Tyre in Phoenicia. In 301, he produced his most important work, the Aeneads. Fragments survive of his Against the Christians, which was condemned to be burned in 448. Porphyry wrote a history on the life of Pythagoras and On Abstinence, a plea for vegetarianism, and in On the Cave of the Nymphs, he describes the symbolism of a grotto mentioned in Homer in relation to the cave rituals of Mithraism. Porphyry was also a tutor to the Syrian philosopher Iamblichus, another famous descendant of the priest kings of Emesa. Iamblichus sought to revive paganism by a return to its roots among the Babylonians and Egyptians, the leading proponents of classical thought like Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, and finally, in the Mysteries. He has generally been credited with the transformation of the merely spiritual Neoplatonism of Plotinus in favor of theurgy, the magical conjuration of the gods, a subject which he treats in his work on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. Well, theurgy is a little more than that. It has to do with de-objectifying the material world, essentially, and becoming closer to the spiritual world. Chaldean oracles. Emperor Julian, known as the Apostate, presides over a conference in 361. Emperor Julian was known as the Apostate because he tried to return Rome back from a Christian state to, back to a Roman pagan state. Through highly metaphysical interpretations of Plato, particularly the Timaeus and Parmenides, later Neoplatonists believed it possible to arrive at a complete understanding of divine truth, held to be cryptically revealed by the gods themselves through the so-called theologians, the inspired authors of the Orphic poems and the Chaldean oracles. The Chaldean oracles, a work attributed to Zoroaster and said to have been revealed to Julian the Theurgist, also known as the Chaldean oracles, of which only fragments are preserved, is a theosophical text in verse composed in the 2nd century AD that combined Platonic elements with Persian or Babylonian creeds. Though its influence is underplayed by modern scholars, it was regarded by the later Neoplatonists as a sacred text, sometimes even above Plato himself. Proclus would have withdrawn all books from circulation, except the Timaeus and the Chaldean oracles, to prevent them from harming the uneducated. Referring to the Chaldean oracles, the Emperor Julian mentions the following in what is generally regarded as one of his few allusions to the doctrine of the Mithraic mysteries. And if I should also touch on the secret teachings of the mysteries in which the Chaldean, divinely frenzied, celebrated the God of the 7 rays, that God through whom he lifts up the souls of men, I should be saying what is unintelligible, yea, wholly unintelligible to the common herd, but familiar to the happy theurgists. The doctrine of the Chaldean oracles spoke of emanations from the Father, equated with fire, and of triadic entities. The highest entities mentioned in the oracles are an absolutely transcendent first paternal intellect. A second demiurgic intellect proceeds from the Father and knows the cosmos as well as himself. Within the first intellect, a female power, Hecate, produces or is the mediating world soul. At the bottom end of the all lies matter, made by the demiurge. The world is a foul tomb and a form which the higher human soul must escape, shedding the lower soul's vehicle or garment acquired during its descent through the stars and the planets. Ascetic conduct and correct ritual will free the soul from the astrological confines of fate and defend it against the demonic powers who fill the realm between gods and mortals. Theurgy. The theurgy of the Chaldean oracles provided knowledge of the magical formulas to aid the soul on its ascent to union with the god. Some scholars claim that the theory of the passage of the soul through the seven heavens was known to Numenius, who transmitted it to Porphyry, though, as Culianu has pointed out in Psychonodia 1, a survey of the evidence concerning the ascension of the soul and its relevance, evidence is lacking, and while Porphyry certainly knew the doctrine, the principal testimonies come from Macrobius and Proclus. According to Proclus, the vehicle of every particular soul descends by the addition of vestures, increasingly material, and ascends in company with the soul through divestment of all that is material and recovery of its proper form, after the analogy of the soul which makes use of it. For the soul descends by the acquisition of irrational principles of life, and ascends by putting off all those faculties tending to temporal process with which it was invested in its descent, and becoming clean and bare of all such faculties as serve the uses of the process. Though not considered magic, the theurgy of the Neoplatonists was essentially those procedures of Hellenistic magic. Its aim was that outlined in the Hermetic treatise, the Asclepius, that is, the incarnation of a divine power or spirit, either into a material object, such as a statue, or a human being, to bring the subject under a state of prophetic ecstasy. The practice was justified by the idea, first, that each part of the universe reflects every other part, and secondly, that the whole material world is the reflection of the invisible divine powers. Such that, resulting from the network of forces or sympathies linking image to archetype, manipulation of the appropriate material object that corresponds to a divine power brings the theurgist into contact with it. The principle also justified the production of long lists of stones, plants, animals, expressing the power of the seven planets, and substantiated the belief that the sympathy linking all parts of the universe allowed the magician to attract the power of the divine spheres. There's more stuff you can learn about reading Aleister Crowley. The Roman Emperor Julian was Neoplatonism's greatest convert. Called by Christians the apostate, he was also an ardent devotee of the Mithraic mysteries, to which he had been introduced by the philosopher Maximus of Ephesus. To Julian, Mithras was the sun and one and the same with Apollo, Phaethon, Hyperion, and Prometheus. To his god he dedicated his hymn to Helios, and introduced the cult to Constantinople, when simultaneously the first Tauribolia were celebrated at Athens. Referring to the Chaldean oracles, Julian mentions the following in what is generally regarded as one of his few allusions to the doctrine of the Mithraic mysteries. And he says it again. And if I should also touch on the secret teachings of the mysteries, in which the Chaldean divinely frenzied celebrated the God of the seven rays, that God through whom he lifts up the souls of men, I should be saying what is unintelligible, yea, wholly unintelligible to the common herd, but familiar to the happy theurgists. By the end of the 4th century AD, the Platonic Academy at Athens had been re-established and had become an institute for Neoplatonic teaching and research in the tradition of Iamblichus. The Academy's inclination toward paganism did much to attract Christian hostility, and though it safeguarded itself for quite some time from the animosity, the Academy eventually succumbed to it and was probably closed by Emperor Justinian in 529 AD. Hermetica. The painting depicts Cambyses II, Emperor of Persia, captured Pharaoh Psammetichus III's captured Pharaoh Psammetichus III, ending the 26th dynasty of Egypt. Yikes. Okay. In the Phaedrus, through the mouth of Socrates, Plato declared, referring to the Thoth, the Egyptian equivalent of Hermes, that the story is that in the region of Naucratis in Egypt, there dwelt one of the old gods of the country, the god to whom the bird ibis is sacred. His own name begins Thoth. He it was who invented numbers and arithmetic and geometry and astronomy, not to mention drafts and dice, and the most important of all, writing. Iamblichus maintained that Plato and Pythagoras derived their philosophy from the wisdom of the Egyptians found on the pillars of Hermes. Manetho was also thought to have derived his knowledge of the history and religion of the ancient Egyptians from secret hieroglyphics that had been inscribed on two pillars, called the Pillars of Hermes, that preserved this knowledge from before the flood. This story reflects a similar legend reported by Josephus about Seth, the third son of Adam, also often identified with Hermes. Josephus recounts that Adam had forewarned his descendants through Seth that sinful humanity would be destroyed by a flood. According to Josephus, the descendants of Seth, identified by some with the sons of God of the Bible, also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is connected with the heavenly bodies and their order, astrology. In order to preserve their astrological science and philosophy, they raised two pillars, one brick and the other of stone, on which were inscribed the keys to their knowledge, which Josephus claimed remained in Egypt to his day. However, that knowledge which was falsely attributed to the Egyptians should be more properly assigned to the Magi. As is rarely acknowledged, Egypt came under Persian rule with the conquest of Cambyses in 525 BC and remained as such except for an interruption of 60 years until the conquest of Alexander at the end of the 4th century BC. In Alien Wisdom, The Limits of Hellenization, Arnaldo Momigliano remarked, "I cannot indicate a dividing line between what is thought to be Egyptian and what is thought to be Chaldean, even in the muddled form in which the Chaldean and Zoroastrian became synonymous. As Cumont indicated, the first Greco-Egyptian astrologers did not invent the discipline they claimed to teach the Hellenic world. They used Egyptian sources going up to the Persian period, which were themselves at least partially derived from ancient Chaldean documents. Traces of this primitive substratum still survive in our much later texts, erratic blocks transported on to more recent soil. When we find mentions there of the King of Kings or satraps, we are no longer in Egypt but in the ancient Orient. We limit ourselves to noting that in all appearances, the priests who were the authors of Egyptian astrology stayed relatively faithful to the ancient Oriental tradition." Quite a number of collections of Hermetic writings must have once existed, the earliest of which was the text addressed to a King Neshepso by the priest Petrosiris. Some texts were gathered together at an unknown date in what is called the Corpus Hermeticum, which still exists. Another collection was made by John Stobaeus in the 5th century AD, and most of it has been preserved. We know little of three others, one used by the Christian writer Lactantius, another quoted by Iamblichus in the early 4th century, and one of 15 books cited by the Christian theologian Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century AD. Two others, longer texts stand alone. The first is the Asclepius, preserved in a Latin translation, possibly of the 3rd century AD. It is known and cited by St. Augustine. The second is a dialogue between Isis and Horus, entitled Kore Kosmu, which may mean daughter of the world. Stobaeus contains extracts from it. Although presented in an Egyptian framework, scholars have recognized that the Hermetic works contain very few genuine Egyptian elements. Francis Yates noted that. In any case, they were certainly not written in remotest antiquity by an all-wise Egyptian priest, as the Renaissance believed, but by various unknown authors, all probably Greeks, and they contain popular Greek philosophy of the period. a mixture of Platonism and Stoicism, combined with some Jewish and probably some Persian influences. The famous text is the first text of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Poimandres, I've read that, in which the author tells us that he has been carried away in the spirit and met a superhuman being, Poimandres. Excuse my pronunciation. The work begins with an outline of the creation of light and separation of darkness, the separation of the waters above from the waters below, the separation of land and water, the creation of heavenly bodies, then birds, fish, and land animals. C.H. Dodd, in The Bible and the Greeks, his extensive study of Jewish influence on the Hermetica, has determined that while the cosmogony of Poimandres is substantially a combination of Platonic and Stoic doctrines of a type familiar in the Hermetica, it is presented through the medium of a myth obviously similar to the creation myth of Genesis. In a sequence similar to the Poimandres, according to Genesis 1 through 2, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Excuse me. These similarities were also recognized by Michael Psellos, a Byzantine scholar of the 11th century A.D., who remarked of the author, This wizard seems to have had more than a passing acquaintance with Holy Writ. Making an eager go of it, he tries his hand at the creation of the world, not scrupling to record the cherished Mosaic expressions themselves. Cyril of Alexandria, a Christian theologian of the 5th century A.D., noted, This Hermes of Egypt, although he was a theurgist, ever sitting in the temple precincts near the idols, had the good sense to acquire the writings of Moses, even if he did not use them at all blamelessly or correctly, having but a part of them. The one in Athens who collected the 15 books called Hermetic made himself a record of this in his own writings. To excuse the obvious Neoplatonic influences in the Hermetic works, Iamblichus argued that, for the books which are circulated under the name of Hermes contain Hermetic opinions, though they frequently employ the language of the philosophers. For they were translated from the Egyptian tongue by men who were not unskilled in philosophy. However, the Hermetic works must be primarily seen as expressing philosophical ideas. According to the Poimandres, light or fire is spirit, nous, or mind. The Logos is the Son of God, at one with the Father, mind. Next, mind gives birth to a second spirit, the demiurge, who creates the 7 administrators or the planets, embracing in their orbit the visible universe. Their administration is called fate. The original spirit also gives birth to the original man, or archetypal man, to whom is assigned the world of the stars. To the Hermetic philosopher Zosimus of Panopolis, the primordial man is the Son of God, or the first man, whose name is Thoth. The Chaldeans and Parthians and Medes and Hebrews call him Adam, which is by interpretation virgin earth, and blood-red earth, and fiery earth, and fleshy earth. And these indications were found in the book collections of the Ptolemies, which they stored away in every temple, and especially in the Serapeum, when they invited Ascenis, the chief priest of Jerusalem, to send a Hermes, who translated the whole of the Hebrew into Greek and Egyptian. Though clearly derived from the mythology of the mysteries, C.H. Dodd maintained that it should be clearly understood that we have no reason whatsoever for supposing that the writers of the corpus at any rate were devotees of any of these religions in the same sense of practicing the ritual which was their essential nature. However, the Poimandres prescribes a mode of spiritual ascent through the 7 planets and into the 8th sphere, where the soul of the initiate is united with God. According to the Poimandres, man must first undergo a spiritual death and resurrection, followed by an ascent through the spheres of the 7 planets, leaving behind him in each part of them part of his being, the part which the original man had received from the stars. Finally, he will be reduced to just himself, where he can enter the 8th sphere to join the powers assembled there. With them he comes before the Father and enters God. The extremely influential Asclepius is a discussion between Hermes, Asclepius, Tat, and Ammon. Following a cosmological exposition of the universe and man's purpose in it, the Asclepius then turns to the subject of theurgy, or of man's ability to create gods, a subject that was regarded by the Neoplatonists as comprising the wisdom of the Egyptians. Our ancestors, declares the Asclepius, discovered the art of creating gods. They made statues, and because they could not create souls, they conjured the souls of demons or messengers and introduced them by holy and godly mysteries into the images of the gods, so that they received the power to cause good and evil. The first Asclepius and the first Hermes were among the gods created in this way, and they are the ancestors of the speakers in the dialogue. Isis was also made in this way. These gods are approached through sacrifices, hymns, and praises. Here's an image of Maria the Jewess. Among the subjects within the large literature under the name of Hermes were alchemical works that represented a system of magic based on an assumed astrological affinity between the stars and certain minerals or plants. In Hellenistic times, the founder of the alchemical art was thought to have been Osthenes, to whom several works on the nature of plants and minerals were ascribed. One of the first alchemical works, written by a certain Bolus of Mendes in the 2nd century BC, was attributed to Democritus, the reputed student of Osthenes. The doctrine of the alchemists was based on Jewish legend. According to Democritus, it was the law of the Egyptians that nobody must divulge these things in writing. The Jews alone have attained a knowledge of its practice, and also have described and exposed these things in a secret language. Sorry, I'm going to stop snorting and clearing my nose. In an early alchemical manuscript, a priestess who calls herself Isis and who addresses her writings to her son Horus declares that she owed her knowledge to the first of the angels and prophets, Amniel, and explains that she acquired her wisdom as a reward for intercourse with him. Mary was also Mary the Jewess. Her teachings were reserved for Jews. For speaking of the holiness of her book, she said, "Do not touch the stone of the sages, for you are not the seed of Abraham." Other important alchemists were Theosebia and a woman who called herself Cleopatra. The most notable fragment left by Cleopatra was a single page of symbolic diagrams. One of its images showed the famous symbol of the Ouroboros, a serpent swallowing its tail, with the phrase, "The one is the all," inscribed within the circle. You can probably see it right here. The brother of Theosebia, Zosimos of Panopolis, of the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 4th century AD, was probably the most important of the Alexandrian alchemists. Zosimos elaborated on the subject and gives the name of a very early master of the art, the mysterious Chemes. It was thought that Chemes had written a book which he called Chema, with which the sons of God had given lessons to the daughters of men. From chemes and chema was derived chemia, a name which was given to the art itself. The Greek word chemia was the designation for alchemy until the Arabs added it to the article al. Oh, interesting. Because I had heard the story that chemistry, or alchemy, came from chem with a K, which was the name of Egypt in ancient times. He's saying it actually comes from this character, Chemes. Cool. Okay. He's got sources. Source 103. If you guys want to learn more about that, look at Ibid. Very good. So that finishes the Hellenistic age. The next part is the Book of Revelation. I will be beginning that in another video. We can take a little look down. Yeah, it's going to get pretty interesting. Can't tell you exactly when that video is going to come out. As I mentioned, I would probably like to read some other stuff in the meantime. So I will get to this, but I can't say it's going to be my next reading video. Plus, you probably see that there's other videos on my channel. I like to do death metal vocals, and I think I'm going to be doing some of that soon. So the next few uploads will not be from ORDO ab CHAO. I thank you for your interest in ORDO ab CHAO, and I will be returning to it eventually. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.